Final Fantasy XVI is a game
Obviously.
that reaches some of the greatest highs of all time. And that is not a hyperbole.
Are you sure about that?
The cinematic moments are some of the best in all of gaming. The story, the performances, and the cinematics are absolutely exceptional. And paired with the fast-paced combat, by the end of the experience, I was silent. I didn't even really know what to say or write down in my notes once I finished the game. I just needed a little time to digest the whole package, which is partially why it took me a little bit of time to make this review. I really needed a little bit of extra time to let my critiques of the game kind of sink in as well and see if they actually made sense after a little bit of time passed. Because while this game does almost everything right, there are some issues that I have. The side content especially is a little bit of a mixed bag, and some of the world exploration leaves a little bit to be desired. And for a game that's gonna run you like $70 right now, kinda do hope that everything's gonna be at least really close to perfect. But that being said, I think this game really is excellent and worth the money. But now I'm gonna get a little bit more into the details of why I think Final Fantasy XVI is one of the best Final Fantasy games of all time, as well as one of the best games in 2023. There will be a couple like minor spoilers, especially maybe a little bit more visually, so just keep that in mind. But I will keep most of this spoiler free, and all the spoilers that I do want to talk about, I'm going to leave to a spoiler section. Since the game came out, the story of Final Fantasy XVI has been kind of described as a mix of Game of Thrones with some of the usual Final Fantasy tropes. And yeah, I think on a surface level, that's pretty true. You have your characters like Clive's mom that's, just a Cersei Lannister knockoff. But the game's opening hours really do go hard into the politics, no hards bold, to the point where some of the intro cutscenes didn't even really make sense till a little bit later in the story.
I am so confused.
It's definitely darker than the traditional Final Fantasy game for sure, but this game, despite its Western influence and Shrek references, is still very much a JRPG. In fact, a lot of its naming conventions and themes are kind of similar to last year's Xenoblade 3. There's a lot of talks of origins and a complete disregard for most human lives in the world, both very similar in both games. There's even some voice actor similarities as well in the game. The first half of the story really hooked me into the story, and I actually don't really have too much of a problem with that first half. It's more around the second, 2/3 to third of the game where there's some points where some pacing issues start to rear their ugly head like a sloth trying to cross the street.
Help me!
1 minute you're battling a god in space, and then the next you're collecting crap off the ground for some little girl's project.
Yeah, boy.
And I also think games like Xenoblade have done a really good job at kind of balancing the side content and the main story, and the slower moments versus the big bombastic crazy moments. But in Final Fantasy XVI, the highs are extremely high.
I'm so f***ing high right now!
But the lows also had me basically falling asleep at my controller, and that's just not something you really want when you're playing one of these high energy action games. Those peaks and valleys rear their head every once in a while, and sometimes are just a little too jarring for a game that is in the running for some of the most epic shit ever award. Somehow they keep one-upping themselves every single time, and the entire game with every boss, I honestly don't know how they did it. Every time I was like, wait, this isn't the final boss of the game? The icon battles have a lot of what I've been wanting to see more of, but the large weighty battles of two monsters is always a thrill for me, and this game's depiction of two nuclear powerhouses duking it out in a ring never ceased to amaze me from the first until the last. The combat of Final Fantasy XVI is another tremendous feat of this game. It's a little simple in the beginning, for a little bit too long for my personal taste, but once it really starts picking up, it picks up to the point where you're getting so many new abilities. I doubt most people are using the exact same builds. The slashing and blasting is fantastic, as the combat to me feels like a weird hybrid mix of a God of War and like Kingdom Hearts actually. More than like the Devil May Cry, which I think has been compared a lot more. But one of the best things about DMC is you basically can infinitely juggle enemies, and you don't really ever have to hit the floor too much. And the inputs for a lot of the moves in Devil May Cry are kind of more like a fighting game, which this game does not have. But here I think it's a lot more similar to something like God of War, where you have a couple different combat styles that you can switch between to whatever suits your fancy. But getting to the next combat encounter or boss was one of the main drivers for me getting through the game. There never feels like a downtime in combat. You're either zipping or zapping enemies or snatching them out of thin air to combo their ass. You're never just walking around trying to find something to hit. It's always really action-packed and really fun. And that's one of the most important things about an action game is, are you having fun? And Final Fantasy XVI nails that. This game also has some of the most flashy abilities to look at. And not only do they look cool, but they're also really strong. And that's just not true in all games. Some games have really strong abilities that kind of look like shit, and vice versa. But in the end, I think very few people will be disappointed with this flashy combat system that they developed for this game. And if you don't agree, I would love to hear your opinion. Please send me a fax with your thesis on why this game's combat is shit. But now, let's talk about some of the characters and performances throughout the game, as I think that's something that's really important for any JRPG game like this. In my opinion, this game has some of the best Final Fantasy characters and performances of all time. Cid is an absolute Chad and dad, and he is an absolutely amazing character. Every time he is on screen, I'm enthralled by his gravelly, intense voice that's like a mix between sandpaper and a cloud in my ears, which doesn't sound like it makes sense outside of the context of this game, but I think if you've heard it, you kind of get what I mean. And the excellent dialogue for this character and all his snarky comments and mentorly vibes towards Clive is just excellent.
Good question. Shout.
Jill is easily one of the more in-depth and fleshed out romantic characters in the series. I've always been hung up on the fact that since Final Fantasy X, I don't really think there's been too many great romances in a lot of the Final Fantasy games, even though they've definitely tried. But then this game came around and delivered one of the most beautiful relationships in a game, not just Final Fantasy. Also, there's Torgal, who is definitely the best dog. Not only helpful in combat, but he's also the bestest boy that probably anyone could ever ask for. And his side quest will make you weep like a sprinkler on a golf course. But there's also plenty of other great characters like Joshua, who plays Clive's brother, and Dion, who I think is just a fabulous, honorable dragoon, and one of my favorite characters in the game as well. Uncle Byron and Gav are also some great comedic reliefs through a lot of the moments in the game that never cease to give me a smile on my face.
Infectious flax wench?
And these are some of the standout side characters, but the main leading slutty Dracula man-meat Clive himself is very excellent for a Final Fantasy protagonist. And his voice actor and performance has to be up there for one of the best of this year, since this game is very Clive-centric, he needed to be a really well-written character, and I think they've really nailed that story from a young teen to a grown adult that's responsible for everyone, and he's so well acted and written, it is a joy through and through. And overall, with all the other side characters that you'll interact with and a lot of the main villains, I think they're all just a treat to watch. Some of the villains are complex, but some of them are also just comically evil, and you know what, sometimes that's just a joy to watch in a game. But next I want to talk a little bit about the world, as that's almost a whole character in itself. The concept designs for a lot of the cities are amazing and an architect's wet dream. Or a nightmare if they actually had to build probably one of those. But I just got so excited to see every new city design, and I was just in awe every single time. The graphics just make this world look so pretty, and all the concepts are really good, but sometimes the levels themselves are just a little bland, and you're going to do a lot of running around through them. There was just so many times where I was just running around with nothing really going on between quest marker to quest marker. Once you get into the battles though, it's bang bang bang, but not after you spend like 10 minutes running around the area of interest, which is something most character action games kind of do away with and don't have as much of an issue. They're designed to have a set amount of encounters that keep you busy, so you're not running around quite as much. And I don't know if this is something even a lot of other AAA games have really figured out. I mean, there's a lot of distraction in other games, and games like God of War are pretty similar, but at least there's some puzzles to kind of break up the monotony. But Final Fantasy, you're just kind of running and sprinting around, And you also don't even have really a dedicated run button, which kind of like, what the fuck? I mean, I really wish I had something like that to at least break out into a breakneck speed and get to the next point really fast. And eventually you do get a chocobo, which saves us a little bit of time, but it also fascinates me that this was just a side quest that someone could probably completely miss and not even part of the main story. And if you miss that, I am sorry. It also kind of sucks a little bit because if this was a little bit more of a traditional character action game, I probably really would have wanted to replay this game multiple times. But the thing that really stops me from wanting to play this game through again on the harder difficulty is just the fact that I know I'll have to like run around a lot and do some of the mandatory side quests. And yeah, that just stops me right away from even wanting to try out something else. The side quests in the game have probably been one of the biggest points of contention, if anything, in this, and that's probably why a lot of people have not rated this game a 10 out of 10 perfect, despite all the amazing things that it does. And I would have a tendency to agree, but this is one of the things that made me stop a little bit, and I just wanted to kind of let those digest and try out as many as I could before I actually started making this review. And I've come to the conclusion after playing a lot of them is there is so many amazing side quests in the game. There's so many that really flesh out this gritty world, and those side quests that go into the backstories of a lot of characters that you probably will come to love are some of the best in the entire Final Fantasy series. There's also side quests that go dark. I mean, some of the darkest stuff I think I've ever seen in a game. I'm talking dad giving his kids front row seats to watch someone get murdered for funsies.
Yeah, boy.
But then there's also shit in the game that's like, go get some boat materials for like 30 minutes, and then in the end, you don't really even get that much of a reward from it. The hunts are also an exceptional part of the side content for this game. You roll up to a message board guarded by a Moogle with a little bit of information about some monster laying about them. After you get some of that information, you go out, explore a little bit, trying to find that monster, and then once you do, you're usually in for a pretty epic boss fight. Now, these aren't usually as epic as a lot of the icon battles from the main story, but they are also so much fun nonetheless. And because the combat system in this game is so great, any excuse to just keep fighting monsters is a good choice in my opinion. And overall, Final Fantasy XVI is an excellent package and something I highly recommend you play if you have a PlayStation 5. The graphics look amazing, the world design is fantastic, and the story is something that Square Enix is going to have to work really hard to best in their next game. And some of the gripes that I had and maybe some other people had with the game might be something you wouldn't even have a problem with. And I think the potential to really deep dive into the lore and story of this game far surpasses pretty much anything else this year. So if that's something that you really like to do, you are going to love this game. The ATL and the old man will be your best friend. I don't know what you're still doing here. You should be going out and playing this game or one of the other million other excellent games that have come out this year. Crack out.
You're just a big puppy, aren't you? A very big puppy.